So I guess we're going to get started. Is this even on? It is on. Look at that. It's my great honor to introduce this motley collection of critical sociologists and critical criminologists, whom I love so deeply that I actually pulled the utility jacket off the back of my office door and threw it on for you. We are here to... I'm sorry, I'm Dan Stageman. I'm the Director of Research here at the college. And welcome to the first in our spring 2020, it's 2020 now, isn't it? Series of book talks. This is Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment, co-edited by David Brotherton and Philip Kretsedemas. And thanks for coming. I'm going to introduce in no particular order. Philip Kretsedemas, second from right, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts-Boston and co-editor of Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment. His own chapter in the volume examines 200 years of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have shaped the scope and limits of local immigration lawmaking. He's currently undertaking a study that uses case law on refugee asylum decisions to examine how normative constructions of democratic political value and community are used to shape definitions of intolerable violence, which is, if I am correct, the standard by which asylum is granted, or one of the standards. Yeah. And also looks at how this relationship has changed over time and varied in its application to different kinds of asylum seekers and social issues. Welcome, Phil. The rest of our three are all products of or current professors at CUNY colleges. So all the way to our left, we have Shirley Leyro, who is assistant professor of social sciences, human services, and criminal justice at CUNY's own borough of Manhattan Community College, and an alumna of John Jay's master's and PhD programs, and my spiritual sister. She and I were members of the same criminal justice PhD program cohort here at John Jay. We co-edited the volume Outside Justice, Immigration and the Criminalizing Impact of Changing Policy and Practice with Professor Brotherton. We defended our dissertations within a week of each other, and we frequently write and publish together to this day. So welcome, Shirley. Her chapter in Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment examines the fear of deportation as a barrier to immigrant integration, and her ongoing research agenda looks at the ways that immigrant vulnerability to enforcement actions affects a host of public health and quality of life issues, including mental health and participation in education. Pretty good? That's all. Second from left, am I going in the right direction here? I think I am. Is Sarah Tosh, who is freshly an assistant professor of sociology, anthropology, and criminal justice at Rutgers University Camden, and a graduate of the CUNY Graduate Center's program in sociology, and a student of Professor Brotherton's. Her work examines the demonization of immigrants through association with crime and the public policy consequences of those processes. Her chapter in Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment examines the sociology of vindictiveness and the deportable alien. And finally, last but not least, David Brotherton is professor of sociology here at John Jay College, co-editor of Immigration Policy in the Age of Punishment, and a multi-award winning critical criminologist. I won't even begin to list them, those awards. His signature books, both co-written with John Jay's own Luis Barrios. Is Luis out there? No? Oh, well. Are The Almighty Latin King and Queen Nation, Street Politics and the Transformation of a New York City Gang, published by Columbia University Press in 2004, and Banished to the Homeland, Dominican Deportees and Their Stories of Exile, also published by Columbia in 2011. He is director of the college's Social Change and Transgressive Studies Project. His current research projects include an evaluation study of the Credible Messengers and Mentors Initiative at the Department of Youth and Rehabilitation Services in Washington, D.C., a criminological investigation of citizenship security in Ecuador, funded by the Guggenheim Foundation, a collaborative critical ethnographic study of immigration removal in New York City called The Social Anatomy of the Deportation Regime, in which I think all of our all of our faculty here are involved. And with Rafa Good is completing the International Handbook of Critical Gang Studies to be published by Routledge in 2020. Welcome all.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, so Phil's gonna, get his thing together. Thanks for coming. Just say a few words. So, so this book is the second of our edited volumes. The first one came out in I think 2008, called appropriately keeping out the other, and it was the first collection of works on deportation post 9/11. So. This was, sort of a benchmark book, if you like. And it raised the issues not simply of deportation, but the kind of failings of mainstream studies in sociology of immigration that mostly focus on assimilation. And here we were talking about this extraordinary level of mass expulsion to which many of my colleagues, unfortunately, in social science were not responding until fairly recently. The absurdity, really, of this hegemonic paradigm in the period of what Saskia Sassen calls a period of mass expulsions really reflects the US-centric lens of so much social science, despite all the calls for anti-coloniality and decolonizing our language. So together with Phil, my esteemed brother there from UMass-Boston, we entered the call of a second edition, and this time taking into consideration the withering democratic climate of the Trump regime, with immigration and deportation now major campaign issues of this oligarchic president. In this edition, we reached out to our friends and comrades around the world in Canada, Dominican Republic, Australia, France, Mexico, and United Kingdom, plus a range of researchers discussing different aspects of the regime, both empirically and theoretically, from a critical perspective. And we are very proud of the results. With the quality, the contributions, and the new insights gleaned from this era of immigration policies, basically based on threats, panics, destabilization, militarization, propaganda, surveillance, and human denigration. The politics of punishment is the politics of othering, vis-à-vis immigration, deportation, and mass incarceration. And inherent in our so-called deterrent strategy that's been on the books roughly since 1984, when I first started practicing protection through deterrence in El Paso, Texas, through to more recent times of Obama, Deporter-in-Chief as he was called, in 2014 under the DHS Secretary at that point, G. Johnson. And this policy of protection or prevention through deterrence, as you know, that anybody you read the listings of people found in the desert or caged at the border, filled with cynicism, cruelty, and endless suffering. It's been on the books through both the Democratic and the Republican president. In fact, you might as well call it a demo-publican policy. This anti-humanistic policy continues unabated, revved up by our autocratic member, resident of the White House, and will now become, or has already become, fully entrenched policy, not simply externally, at the external borders, but internally at our borders, very close to home. You go on a train upstate, you look like an immigrant, you get carded, pulled aside, what's your ID, and may be arrested. If you live in an immigrant community out in the suburbs in Long Island or somewhere in New Jersey, you can expect a 5 o'clock knock if you happen to live in a mixed household with an undocumented immigrant or an LPR with some kind of criminal record over the last 25 years. A couple of days ago, our fearless leader of DHS announced that ICE SWAT teams are coming, so beware. Singling out sanctuary cities in his usual regime of vindictiveness, he's sending to us the guys, mainly guys, maybe a few girls as well, from this group called BORTAC, Border Patrol and Tactical Units, established in, nota bene, 1984. Has about 250 members that operate under the Special Operations Group, known as SOG, that works with BORSTAR, Border Patrol, Search, Trauma, and Research Unit. So you get where I'm going. We're going henceforth into the brave new world with all its nomenclatura and abbreviations. So we really are, well and truly, in an age of punishment, an age of vindictiveness, an age of endless cruelty, and an age that very much befits the kind of dominant economic paradigm of our lifetime, which is neoliberalism. So without further ado, I'll introduce my brother, Phil Kretsedemas, Associate Professor from UMass-Boston.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to give an overview, really, of research and legal developments that's relevant to the chapter that I wrote, for immigration policy in the age of punishment. And actually, this is the first slide. I'm actually glad that Dave's, wrap up there actually tied directly into what I'm going to get into. I should qualify that, when we actually were putting this book together, it was at it was the last year of the Obama administration. We didn't know Trump was going to be elected, and so it ended up in the process being a book about late Obama era policy, with an eye to the Trump era, and my chapter was on, the struggle over anti-immigrant local laws. At the time in the Obama era with, again, a Democratic presidency, the way that debate sort of shaped up is you had a federal government that was, still presiding over just these unprecedented, these deportations of unprecedented scale, but was willing to push back against, governments that were, passing local laws. And again, this was largely like a political battle. You might recall that the big case, the last big case that occurred was in Arizona, where the state of Arizona enacted, a controversial series of laws, which there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of theory, I guess, as to why they enacted it. But one was that they were just trying to scare away Latinos from the polls because they were just losing their grip over, the electorate there. Like there's other theories as to why they were doing it. And it was a precedent-setting case because it was the first time that the federal government actually directly sued a state. Actually, in that case, like the suit was brought by Eric Holder. So at the time in putting the book together, we didn't know what was going to happen, but this is still like a very live debate. Now, what's happened since that time is that this debate over federal versus local lawmaking powers has kind of subsided due to the election of Trump, and I'll get into that in a little bit as to why, perhaps it's the debate has fizzled out. But I think a lot of the issues that the debate touched on are still relevant, for a theory of state power and the reasons why, like, the state is acting the way it is. Like right now, like the current update on this on the status perhaps of this issue is just a few days ago, Trump just announced that he's sending in again like these tactical teams of border protection officers into so-called sanctuary cities, basically what's happened in the Trump era very, very quickly is we've shifted from this debate over conservative, we'll say, political coalitions trying to pass anti-immigrant laws at the local level to conservative attacks on progressive local immigration laws, right? I mean, like that's basically like what's happened. Let me just give you a quick, I'm a little, okay, great. Okay, here. So now I should note that these slides perhaps really just to keep me on track. I'm hoping that you'll be able to read them, but it's but I'll go over like the highlights. In the Obama era, again, like what you have is the immigration control movement is really trying to push its agenda through local laws. It's arguing for this standard of what we'll say local sovereignty. Arguing that local governments have inherent authority over immigration. Which arguably, like prior to 1875, actually, immigration hadn't been occupied by the federal government, and so they were pulling on, I guess, this history of lawmaking, to make that argument. And there's a change in tactics in the Trump era where the energy, like in the immigration control movement, shifts away from trying to pass laws at the local level to challenging progressive laws, right? But at the federal government, and it's hard to say this with any degree of complete confidence because we haven't really seen any major law suits that have gone to the Supreme Court right now. But in the Obama era, the federal government counters by asserting its supremacy over immigration law. Now, I think implicitly, or at least I'd have to assume that the Trump administration is basically doing the same thing, and that its response to what's going on at the local level is not to support local law-making powers of conservative coalitions, but to use its authority over immigration enforcement, to send in federal agents, to intimidate people at the local level. But all that operates within the federal supremacy argument, effectively, because what they're doing is they're not trying to deputize local police. They are just using federal agents, which is exactly what the Obama administration was doing, right? So there is that continuity. Whoops, wrong way. And in the history of at least Supreme Court decision making, and I should note that my study focuses just on Supreme Court decision making, and so it does miss like a large swath of what we'll say of federal jurisprudence certainly, but I use what's going on at the Supreme Court at least of an indicator of key patterns. That in the debate over the lawmaking powers of local government, and oftentimes in cases that have scaled back those powers, that have pushed back against them and actually have, either directly or inadvertently like supported immigrant rights, there are these two key arguments. Like one, which perhaps maybe seems to intuitively make more sense from a progressive perspective, is a constitutional rights argument, which usually appeals to the 14th Amendment, sometimes like the Fifth Amendment due process. And this can be traced back, at least to like the 1880s, like this argument, right? But there's also a federal supremacy argument, which is not a rights argument. And this is just that the federal government just has, effectively inherent authority, to make decisions about immigration policy. This is the same, in a way, I guess, sovereignty argument that undergirds plenary power, which is, the authority that the federal government exerted, beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act, to disregard the Constitution on matters of immigration, right? But in the context of the debate over local laws, this federal supremacy argument has been used quite often actually to push back against restrictive racist local laws. So it sort of has been like I guess, historically more or less progressive application of federal sovereignty, right? And really briefly here, let me see if I can get this right here. I mean, and this is like a really quick summary. Like, again, there were a lot of restrictive laws, being enacted, at the local level, like throughout the 19th century. What's curious is that, basically, like throughout the entire 19th century, there's only one Supreme Court decision that actually affirms restrictive local laws. Pretty much all the decisions that concern the rights of non-citizens or aliens that have been, that are potentially being weakened or restricted by local laws, when they're heard by the Supreme Court, they actually side in favor of basically the non-citizen versus, as opposed to the local lawmakers, right? And you could say that really, the Obama administration's take on this debate is, it's largely consistent with that 19th century history of decision making, and also in its history of decision making that that takes shape from the 80s onwards. And this is a kind of argument that really relies heavily on federal supremacy, right? Just on the sovereignty of federal government over local government to push these decisions. The Trump administration, not surprisingly, is what they're doing right now seems most consistent with this pattern of decisions that occurred in the early 20th century, and this is when the federal, the Supreme Court and just the federal government more generally began to use its sovereign authority in sympathy with local lawmaking powers, and you really had like a lot of like anti-Asian alien land laws and things like that that were basically supported by the Supreme Court. Now again, there haven't been any cases about the legitimacy of local laws that have been heard by the Supreme Court in the Trump era, so this is largely speculation. I don't know what the Supreme Court would decide, but certainly the way that the Trump administration is acting, I think you can sort of assume that, again, that they sympathize with laws, local or federal, that restrict immigrant rights. And this era that's in black in the 1970s through 80s is a sort of anomalous era relative to the present. I mean, this is an era in which the constitutional rights argument is used consistently by the Supreme Court, to support immigrant rights, and they're not just using a federal supremacy argument. They really are, arguing on behalf of immigrant rights on constitutional grounds, and they are strengthening rights. The last major case that, which probably many of you are aware of, that made those kind of arguments was Plyler versus Doe, which is the case that basically affirm the rights of unauthorized migrant children, to attend public schools out in California. Again, this was, in response to a restrictive local law, right? And in this case, like many of these arguments, the Supreme Court used a combination of federal supremacy and constitutional rights arguments, but basically it made a connection between the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the rights of unauthorized migrant children, to attend those schools. This was the first and last Supreme Court decision concerning the lawmaking powers of local governments and non-citizen rights, that dealt with the topic of unauthorized migrants. And again, this decision, I think, in immigrant rights circles has a lot of visibility. Like, people still talk about it. We still write about the implications it has for progressive, policy and law. But it's worth noting that just a couple weeks later, the Supreme Court also decided Toll versus Marino, which also is a decision that actually pushed back against a restrictive local law, but using a very different argument, and which used basically exclusively a federal supremacy argument, right? And this, was a case, actually it was a series of cases involving, I guess this policy at the University of Maryland, but I guess it was consistent with state policy that just denied in-state tuition to non-citizens. The plaintiffs in this case were the dependents of a work visa holder. And the Supreme Court ruled, that it had a complex argument. Basically, it ruled that that the Congress had an interest in encouraging the migration of these people for economic reasons, and that because they were good for the economy, and again, the visa holder had been admitted, under good faith by the Congress, that it was counter to, the interest of Congress to deny in-state tuition to the dependents of the visa holder. But the key point is that in that case, they reviewed a lot of these arguments that, that have been decided in the past that had used constitutional rights arguments. And the only thing of significance that they found in those arguments was not the constitutional rights arguments, but the federal supremacy argument. So effectively, they argued that, that all you really need is an argument about the supremacy of the federal government over local law. Now, this becomes significant because, what you're really doing when you're making those kind of arguments is that you are under federal supremacy. You are just affirming, whoops. Okay, well, actually, I'll leave it at that. Actually, I'll go back a little bit. Whoops. You're affirming the discretionary authority, of course, of the federal government, right? Now, under, of course, like a rights argument, you're affirming a body of rights that actually can be used to check the authority of local government, right? Now, it so happens that in that Arizona versus U.S. case, like the big case that in which Eric Holder filed suit against Arizona for their, for their restrictive local laws around 2011-12 or so. Again, in that case, when the government made its case, it began its case citing Toll versus Marino. So it very clearly, like signaled that it was not interested in a constitutional rights argument. And from the 1980s onwards, what you really see is, the federal government under Obama is, pushing back against local laws, but it's also alienating the progressive argument for immigrant rights, we'll say, in this debate, from the constitutional rights argument. Like, this argument is being marginalized, right? And so what happens now is that in the Trump era, when Trump comes to office, and you have this federal supremacy, like a series of precedents in place, you don't really have, like a strong legal precedent that actually, sort of binds the government to, its obligation, to constitutional rights. Like what we've done is basically, allowed a legal precedent that basically says whatever the federal government decides is good for the country. Like, we will simply trust its discretionary authority, right? And so, we trust Obama's discretionary authority when he's president, and now Trump is in office, and his discretionary authority gets to rule. And irrespective of the political difference in how they're using it, it's consistent with the federal supremacy argument. Like, he's not doing anything, unfortunately, that actually violates the federal supremacy argument. Like the terms of that argument. So that's, basically the gist of the chapter I wrote was just to sort of make note of how, the progressive argument for immigrant rights in the context of this debate specifically, has suffered because it's basically like allowed the constitutional rights argument to be, to be marginalized. I'll leave, and that's my main point. I should note, I don't think I have much more. Do I have? Okay, is that actually moving forward? And I should note that actually, like Dave and a couple of the people sort of raised these questions to me as I was writing this chapter. There's this whole question of, of race, right? I was asked, well, what do you do with, how do you fit race into all this? Obviously, the immigration debate is highly racialized. I've written a lot of stuff on race and immigration. I couldn't actually find a way to fit it in neatly into this. I should know that what I'm doing with my current project, I'm really focusing actually on not just asylum seekers, but Haitian asylum seekers, and sort of just engaging like the critical literature on blackness to understand, their predicament. But like descriptively, looking at this history of decisions racially, is that in the 19th century you have, decisions that largely favor non-citizens, in which the plaintiffs are mostly white, and there's a small minority of Asian non-citizens who also benefit, right? Then the early 20th century, when things get a lot more restrictive, the people that actually are oftentimes the plaintiffs, but they lose their cases, are Asians, and there's a small minority, there's a sizable minority of whites. So basically, like pretty much for the first 150 years or so, these cases largely concern whites and Asian plaintiffs. Of course, the legal precedents extend beyond those groups, but these are largely like the main groups that are contesting the laws. In 70s and 80s, the population becomes more multiracial with a growing number of Latinx non-citizens. And it's notable that in the 80s, when the constitutional rights argument, gets distanced from the progressive argument, that's the point in time in which the, this whole debate begins to address the whole question of the rights of unauthorized migrants. And again, Plyler is the only decision that really, applies a constitutional rights argument to unauthorized migrants. Arizona versus U.S., which is the next major decision that addresses the issue of unauthorized migration, doesn't deal with constitutional rights at all, right? But, this is only like a descriptive overview. Like what I'm trying to do now actually is come to terms with, like how effectively, like there's just a conspicuous absence of black migrants and blackness from this entire, schema, like for this entire history, and to use that absence to actually begin to sort of develop like a new perspective on, on what's going on with, like we'll just say, just the immigration law, right? And I'll leave you just with this one example here, which I really don't have a way of wrapping this up. I'm just going to leave you this with, and like in my history of just the relevant, we'll say, legal context for, especially the debate over the treatment of Haitian asylum seekers. This one decision, Yikwo versus Hopkins in 1886, has loomed pretty large. It's been used actually by liberal legal scholars to make a case. Well, they've tried to apply it to Haitian asylum seekers. This happens to be the very first Supreme Court decision that actually extended the 14th Amendment to non-citizens, right? And I think it's very like interesting to sort of compare and contrast Yickwo Hopkins, to Plessy v. Ferguson, which is a pretty infamous case. We know that basically provided like the legal argument in favor of Jim Crow. Now these cases are oftentimes viewed as belonging to two entirely different histories, but actually there are important continuities that run between them. They both actually involve cases in which you have restrictive, effectively racist local laws that are passed at the local level, that are justified by an argument about police powers, local sovereignty, right? They are both cases in which the 14th Amendment was attempted to be used by people that were pushing back against those laws to support the rights of the targeted racialized minorities, like whether it was in the case of Yickwo versus Hopkins, it was Chinese immigrants. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, of course, it's the U.S. black population. Of course, historically, even though it isn't written into the 14th Amendment, it was widely understood that the 14th Amendment was enacted along with the 13th and the 15th to aid basically the political incorporation of blacks, right? Like after slavery, like these basically were the Reconstruction era like amendments, right? But it so happens that like in Yickwo, what you have is this argument in which the Supreme Court is willing to sort of see the racism effectively that's implicit in the way that a race-neutral law was interpreted. Effectively, it was a laundry license law that didn't actually single out Chinese migrants on the basis of race, but was applied in such a way that every single Chinese laundry business owner pretty much was excluded from their license was revoked. In the case of in that case, they argued very forcefully that that the 14th Amendment applies. This is clearly like a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And that the police powers of local government do not, are being illegitimately used to support this, to support this law. So they push back, local lawmaking powers. And Plessy decided 10 years later, with Yickwo being like an established precedent, the Supreme Court makes a completely different argument. It's support. In this case, of course, with Jim Crow, we're dealing with laws that are explicitly segregating on the basis of race, right? And in that case, the Supreme Court uses a race-neutral rationale, like the separate but equal argument, to basically interpret these explicitly racist laws. It's arguing that the police powers of local government actually are valid, right? And it argues that not so much that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply, but but these laws don't violate the 14th Amendment, right? And actually, you don't get a decision that really is comparable to Yickwo as it applies to the black population until Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s, which is the first, which is the decision that really dismantles Jim Crow, in which the Supreme Court finally pushes back against the police powers of local government, right? So now, what I'm doing right now is using this apparent anomaly, like this huge disparity in Supreme Court decision making, to make sense of effectively the relationship of blacks and blackness to U.S. immigration policy. And I'll just leave it at that. It's a big puzzle. I'm still working through it, but this is my attempt to actually understand how do you build a robust theory of race into this entire history. Right? So thanks.
Hello. Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah Tosh. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I don't know. You could just look wherever you want. So my chapter in the book that I co-authored with Dave centered on the sociology of vindictiveness. Can you guys hear me well? Okay. The sociology of vindictiveness and the deportable alien, right? So how is this culture of vindictiveness, which Jacques Young, the great criminologist, and used to be here at John Jay and the Grad Center, came up with this idea about the sociology of vindictiveness and how we live in kind of a system now in a culture where we're centered on villainization and othering. We need to punish those who have been deemed villainized or other. So it's not just punishment that has some end goal, right? It's more punishment for punishment's sake. And that's kind of one of the defining characteristics of this era of vindictiveness. So we can see this in immigration, definitely, but we see this in other policies. So when we're talking about the age of punishment, we're not just talking about immigration policy, right? So if over the same period where we've seen increasingly more punitive immigration policy, we've also seen mass incarceration, right? The war on drugs, these very, very punitive, militarized criminal justice policies that have been going on for now, up to what now, 4 decades almost, 3 decades, and haven't really reached any of the goals, the stated goals, right? So the war on crime rates are just as high as they were when, we had a far less smaller system of incarceration in the 1980s before it grew to the size it was today. The war on drugs, we keep fighting drugs both here and abroad, and we have, as we all know, we have a huge opioid epidemic going on right now. Rates of drug use have not decreased, right, since the 1980s because of the war on drugs. So in immigration, we see the same thing, right? Increasingly more punitive immigration policy, while it has not worked to deter immigration or stop crime, as is kind of one of the implied impetuses. So this increasingly punitive policy in this age of vindictiveness is, so this increasingly punitive policy is fueled by vindictiveness, right? It's not achieving the stated goals, yet these punitive frameworks remain. Because there's this idea that those who it affects are deserving of punishment, right? So this threat of the special forces coming to sanctuary cities, right? This is a perfect example of how this image of criminality and villainization is continued. So it brings this idea that sanctuary cities are protecting these dangerous criminals, right? That's why we need special forces, special trained people to be deployed to these places. Obviously, that gives this idea that there's very dangerous people that people need to be protected from, right? Why do you need special forces unless there's some villains among us that we need to root out, right? And that's the message that has underlay this policy for many years. So this is not new. This is not beginning in the Trump era, this type of villainization. So throughout this whole period, the criminal alien, folk devil, has really been a central force. So it's played an important role in the shaping of the immigration policy we have today. And this criminal alien term is not just, a term that's used that you hear kind of in speeches or in news reports. This is the official term they have on the law, in the laws that are in place, right? So in the Immigration Nationality Act, the criminal alien is a term that is used to apply to an immigrant with a criminal record. So this has continued to shape policy for many, many years, despite the fact that there's a wide body of research showing that immigrants are no less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. And actually, there's also, even within that body of research, there's even a good deal of research showing that they're less likely to commit crimes. Yet we see this trope of immigrant criminality continually brought out to push more punitive policy. So while obviously some of what is going on today is somewhat unique, this is really still stemming from laws that came about in the 1980s, the 1980s and 1990s. So the same era that brought us mass incarceration and the militarized war on drugs, right? So this idea, this linking of immigrants and crime throughout this period was not just Trump, and we see it very, very clearly today, right? With Trump is saying things like calling Mexican immigrants rapists or saying people are bringing drugs, bringing crime. Obviously, that's a very forceful, putting forthright and basically saying, almost implying that all immigrants are in some way criminal, right? But it's not just in that rhetoric where we see it. We also saw it throughout the Obama administration where, the administration that deported more people than ever in history before. And even though Obama talked about, somewhat more humanitarian aims often, it was always focused on this idea of felons, not families, right? So this idea that we want to deport gangbangers, not just people who are trying to feed their families, right? So it gives this basically implying that people with criminal records have no families, no ties to the community, right? And that these are two completely different groups, which anyone who knows anything about our criminal justice system, or even has even if you don't know much about our criminal justice system, you know about the intense inequality that exists within our criminal justice system. So to take criminal records as this marker of undeservingness, right, and deservingness of deportation, deservingness of removal, often deservingness of banishment from the home that people have known most of their life. since criminal charges are actually the main and really one of the only reasons for deportation for people with green cards, lawful permanent residents. So this good, bad immigrant binary, we need to move past this, right? And the fact that there's not enough research, right, that even is looking at the deportation of people with criminal records. It's something that there has been a dearth of research on. So there's really a need to get past this, and even that lack of research is kind of reinforcing this binary, right? The only immigrants worth talking about, the only deportation worth problematizing is those of the good immigrant, right? People with criminal records are the easy ones to throw under the bus. And my research looks at one of the most vilified categories of criminal aliens, so immigrants who have committed offenses which are known as aggravated felonies. So when we hear the word aggravated felony, right, this sounds so awful, like that a felony is the worst kind of crime, and then aggravated, so it's making it even worse. When in reality, aggravated felony is not even a criminal law category. It's actually an immigration law category. So it's a category of crimes that was created in the late 1980s, actually as part of an Anti-Drug Abuse Act, so part of the same policies that got us into the war on drugs. And when the category was first created, it included 3 crimes: murder, drug trafficking, and weapons trafficking. And also, as we know, drug trafficking, right, it sounds like some big crazy thing, you're in a cartel and all of this. Drug trafficking means any involvement in drug dealing, right? So it could mean selling $10 worth of crack, you're a drug trafficker, right? So even in the beginning, right, there, you could see how a lot of people could fall into this category. So, but still, it was somewhat narrow, and we could maybe agree that, okay, these are crimes that they were very focused on at this time. Yet, over the course of the following decade, and especially in the major immigration reforms of 1996, the category was expanded so greatly that it now includes many crimes that are not even felonies, so it includes many misdemeanors, especially including things like theft, right? So a shoplifting offense with 1-year sentence would be an aggravated felony. It includes a wide variety of drug crimes. Many, many things fall now into this category that a lot of people really have no idea, right? You hear this word and it seems to mean something so extreme, but really it doesn't need to be a felony anymore. Many are misdemeanors, as I said, and the only aggravating factor is actually that the person is a non-citizen, right? So it's a misnomer completely, yet it continues to be used and push people towards deportation. So if you are convicted of an aggravated felony and you're facing deportation based on that, you are subject to mandatory detention, which means that you don't get the due process requirements of criminal law and immigration law. You can be held indefinitely in detention throughout your trial with no chance of a bail hearing. Actually, recent Supreme Court decisions have made this even more, have taken away like any of the opposition that existed to this, and some of the other laws that allowed this to allowed people to sometimes get bail hearings. It made it so that everyone in this category is now mandatorily detained through cases that are extremely complex and can take several years to finish. So in our chapter, we talked a lot about some of the processes and kind of how people are going through this system while they're detained, mandatorily detained, don't have any right to legal representation. So there's no guaranteed legal representation for immigrants facing deportation. In most of the country, New York City is the only place in the country that guarantees legal representation for detained immigrants facing deportation. So people in this category have got this whole new, in New York, people all of a sudden are getting representation on these cases. And another important thing to remember about this category is that it does have a large effect on green card holders. So often people have been here for many, many years. And we know in New York, we obviously have a large lawful permanent resident population, and they're often the people who are the most affected by this. One thing to note is this is also a key example of what is known as CRImigration. So during the same era when everything was getting more punitive, we also saw a lot more interconnecting of immigration and criminal law. So the aggravated felony coming out of drug law, right, and being an immigration law that is based on, or an immigration consequences that are based on criminal convictions, right? You see how it's an example of these systems becoming more and more intricated. But at the same time, enforcement is also a huge part of it too. So people, even people without aggravated felonies, if you're picked up by the police for anything, even in this sanctuary city of New York City, that information is sent straight to databases that immigration enforcement can see. So you can't really talk about immigration law and immigration policy without also talking about the criminal justice system. They are so interconnected during this period. And CRImigration, so this concept of CRImigration, basically is, the idea is that as these two categories became more intertwined, they also, the punitive elements of both are emphasized. So you don't have you lose the due process protections of criminal law, like right to a lawyer or right to bail, right? But you're getting enhanced penalties in the immigration system based on your criminal conviction. So I looked at aggravated felony convictions in New York City. I did court observation and interviews with immigration lawyers and other people involved in the immigration court process to look at the effects of the aggravated felony on people's court cases. And just to give a little idea of the major findings that came out of this study, the expansiveness of the category is definitely something that was a focus of lawyers. They talk about examples like I gave before, right? They talked about how a turnstile jump with a 1-year sentence is a theft sentence that could be considered an aggravated felony. They talked about people sharing drugs with someone else and that being a drug trafficking conviction in New York State because it does not require that you get financial remuneration, and therefore that's an aggravated felony. They talked about people who had crimes from because it also works retroactively. So things that became aggravated felonies in '96, if you did that years before, it's still an aggravated felony. So people are being deported for crimes they committed a decade ago or more, and it's something that wasn't even a deportable offense at the time that they committed it. So definitely the expansiveness of the category was something they emphasized, as well as the severity of the category. So it makes it so that you're mandatorily detained. It takes away almost all forms of relief, legal relief from deportation, so you're left with some of the most difficult ones to prove and to win. The two that are left to people with aggravated felonies are two forms of relief that are granted 1 to 5% of the time, so it's very, very low chances. They're cut off from asylum and other things that is actually an internationally recognized human right? But people in this category, they're not allowed to apply for it, so they're barred. So besides the severity, the expansiveness, people being the due process violations that I've already discussed, you also see the reproduction of inequality, right? So we know how extreme the inequality is in our criminal justice system. We know that at every level of the criminal justice system, people of color, and especially black and brown young men, are the focus and are targeted by our criminal justice system, right? So at the level of arrest, the level of charging, conviction, at every single level, both people of color and also people in lower socioeconomic classes are known to be more affected. When I list this in my literature review, it could go on forever, the amount of studies that talk about this and show this for many, many, many years. Yet in immigration, we just take it for granted, like, oh, this person has a criminal conviction, they should be deported. So inequality is being reproduced, right, through the immigration system and being enhanced, where people's already served a criminal sentence and now are being detained again and banished, often from the only home they knew, based on this criminal conviction. So we need to make big changes. New York's system of universal representation has gone a long way. I did find that there are a lot of resistance arising, or legal resistance, legal strategies that they're able to come up with when there are people focusing on these types of cases. Whereas in most places, if you only have limited resources, these are the people who are last to get representation. So we need to expand some of these reforms that we have had in New York City that are helpful. We definitely need to reform the immigration laws of 1996, which would be a federal change that, unfortunately, I don't see happening anytime very soon. But beyond these immigration law changes, we also need to recognize that there needs to be changes in the criminal justice system, right? So New York City can have great sanctuary policies that help immigrants, but with the biggest police force in the country that is continually having unequal rates of policing and focusing on certain neighborhoods and certain people, those inequalities are going to continue to be pushed into the immigration system, right? And we're going to continue to see immigrants, and especially people of color, placed into this pipeline toward deportation. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Sometimes I don't need a mic and sometimes I do. I'm Puerto Rican, so say less, right? Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that this school on this land occupies what used to be the land of indigenous people. I know some of the groups were the Iroquois, but there were other indigenous peoples whose lands that we're on, so I just want to acknowledge we're on stolen land, and it's just something that I like to say before I speak. So I was really happy to be included in this book. One of the reasons why is, as Professor Phil Kay and Professor Tosh was able to do, they were able, both in the book and in their presentation, they were able to give a picture, right, of the apparatus that is immigration enforcement. So through Supreme Court decisions, legislation, case law, the whole system is really an apparatus that is cruel, it is vindictive, it is violent. And so what I speak to, or what I research is the consequences of this very violent system. And when we think about violence, normally we think about physical violence. And when we think about the impact of violence, we think about bruises, right? So if I were to come into this room and I had bruises over my face, neck, arms, you would think, wow, violence, there was a fight. She is harmed, she is injured, it's clear. But really, when we talk about the violence that happens as a result of an immigration enforcement system, the apparatus, the impact, the injuries are not necessarily apparent, right? Because they are psychological. So I look at the impact that legal violence, which is the violence that's exerted by the state, via this, vindictive, cruel immigration system, how that impacts people and their mental health and their mental well-being. So in my chapter, I give vignettes of some of the participants who were able to share their stories with me about how it is that being a non-citizen in this country, how it is that they're impacted. And just, really, I mean, a very basic way to say is that the fact that they are non-citizens in this country, the fact that they are vulnerable to deportation, the fact that there's such a cruel immigration system that has this imminent, right, surveillance on them, it just makes them just insecure. It makes them, and makes the uncertainty of coming back home one day it makes them not want to leave the house, right? That's just like the basic thing. And so when they do leave the house, the uncertainty of them not knowing if they're going to come back home, that has some serious ramifications, right? So one of the things that I look at is the fact that we have people who are suffering, right? There's this social suffering that happens not just by the individual who is the target of the system, but also their families, their communities. Many of these folks live in mixed status families. So there's a level of uncertainty not just for them, but for their children. Am I going to see my father or my mother when they come back home? The spouses, co-workers, neighbors, so on and so forth. So that's one part. The other part I look at is the fact that, if you live in this country, you could be here 20, 30 years and be deported, right? For something that happened 20, 30 years ago, for something that wasn't even a deportable crime, right? But the fact that you are vulnerable to removal, and by the way, so when we talk about the age of punishment, deportation itself is not a form of punishment. It's technically a legal procedure under the immigration system, but it gets used as punishment, right? It gets used as a form of sanction, and it's like a sentence, right? But technically speaking, it's not, because the immigration system is not a criminal justice system. So none of these things, right? So when a non-citizen immigrant gets arrested, it's not really an arrest, right? Because it's not done by a police officer, it's done by an enforcement officer, but not part of the criminal justice system. Where they're housed looks and feels like a jail, but it's technically not a jail, it's a detention center, right? But for all intents and purposes, it very much mirrors the criminal justice system, and that's what we go, for this idea of the CRImigration, right? The interweaving of a criminal justice system and the civil immigration system. And so just the fact that you could live here so many years and be vulnerable to deportation, having to live with that insecurity and that uncertainty, it impacts a person's sense of belonging, right? And so if you are a non-citizen and you feel that any day now you could be removed, how much could this country be your home? You can have children here. You could have, you know, a job for which you could have worked there forever. It doesn't matter what type of job it is, how much money you make. But you have a life here. You've established yourself here. And for some people, there are actual roots, and they still don't feel like they belong. So bridging my dissertation work, which is the chapter that I have here, with what I'm working on now, is how people's mental health is being impacted by the fact that there is a lack of the sense of belonging. And when I say the sense of belonging, because as a critical theorist, right, what does that mean to belong, and do we really want to belong, and, you know, but really just for, you know, very basic, fundamentally, I'm using the concept of belonging as the experience of personal involvement in a system or environment so that the persons feel themselves to be a part of that system or environment, right? And this could be, you know, we all make our homes. You know, anybody who has a job where there's a desk, you kind of make that desk your home. You put pictures up, you put your little tchotchkes, where you live, if you live in a dorm, you know, in the people who have been involved in criminal justice system, their cells, right, are home. You know, you put pictures up, right? This is what we tend to do, and yet we have an entire population of people who don't feel they belong, and even though they kind of establish roots, it's really not their home, right? They feel like they're not welcome, and that is because of the apparatus that the United States has built over time, over the decades, right, of immigration enforcement. So what I wanted to do was look at, you know, as a professor at CUNY, right? So we already know, and this, you know, this is also part of my presentations, but I don't have to say it because it's already been said, right? This immigration enforcement system, this apparatus, pre-existed the current regime, right? And all of my participants and the fear that they expressed and the desperation and the anguish and the anxiety, the uncertainty, the insecurity, all of that is a product of the previous administration, right? So it's not necessarily the current political climate that has caused damage and harm to people's mental health, but certainly, right, what happens under this current administration has exacerbated it, right, because it's definitely more violent and open. And what happens is we have like this giveth and taketh away climate, right? So for instance, under the previous administration, we got DACA, right, which is deferred action for childhood arrivals. It is not exemption from deportation. It is go back to the line, right, but there are certain protections, and it has helped hundreds of thousands, right, of undocumented young people. But right now, and, you know, Dr. Phil Kay talked about Supreme Court decisions. We have a very big Supreme Court decision coming up, right? Either in March or June, we will find out the Supreme Court decision on DACA, right? Whether or not it's going to exist or not anymore. So there is that sense of insecurity that many of our DACA recipients, documented folks, are experiencing right now. In New York City, right, talk about give it and take it away, we have the New York State DREAM Act, which was a fabulous push, and it was passed, and it allowed for undocumented students to receive funding. And then not a lot of students got funding, right? We have students who receive emails saying, this is your award, and the award is 0.00, right? Or you missed something on your application, and so now you can't get it. And the thing is, like, they launched this database, this application system, right? So the New York State DREAM Act is not the actual funding mechanism, it's more like a portal, right? So an undocumented student will apply through the New York State DREAM Act portal, and then through that portal, it's deemed whether or not they qualify for funding, and then the funding apparatus, usually TAP, is what gives the award, right? And so we have all of these students being told, right, that they apply and that they qualify and they're going to get this funding, and they don't get any, right? So giveth and taketh away, right? Again, that is something that our young people, many of them are students, are experiencing. We have New York licenses, right? So the New York State just passed a law that is going to grant undocumented folks licenses, right? Because we know that in order to survive, even in this city, licenses are important. And what happens the federal government has now punished New York State for doing that, right? So we have like this giveth and taketh away climate that's happening today. And as a, someone who studies the mental health impact of this immigration apparatus, and then someone who works with, teaches, and is in an environment where students, right, I come into contact with students all the time, particularly, undocumented students. I'm the advisor at the school's Undocumented Students Club. I see the anguish and the insecurity that's happening among the students. And so I wanted to bridge my previous work and look at how being a non-citizen student impacts the mental health or sense of belonging to the actual college campus. And the reason why I wanted to do that is we have this system of integration, right? So even, I know it's problematic if we talk about integration because, from a critical point of view, but let's just take for granted that we want everyone to be integrated in our society and be part of the society and feel like they belong to society. The fact that a person is a non-immigrant susceptible to deportation, that puts that into peril. However, we know that college and a college education is a mechanism for which traditionally that is how a person achieves the American dream, social mobility. CUNY loves to tout, the fact that, and we are, right? We're a fabulous organization. We got the best professors, in the world, but really rank 6 in the country, right? In social mobility, yes. So I wanted to see how our undocumented or our non-citizen students, so not just undocumented, how they feel about the school and whether or not they feel protected, whether or not they feel that they will be able to achieve that American dream or achieve that social mobility, which, right, then leads to them feeling like there's a sense of belonging. So this is where I came up with the CUNY Belonging Study, and I conducted the study over the course of about 9 months, and I was able to receive about 172 responses across all of the college campuses except for one. Which was, I can't think of it right now, I'm a little nervous. But I was able to get some data on that. And because I don't want to take too long, very basic preliminary results say that the more precarious a person's status is, so depending on whether or not they're LPR, green card holder, or documented, right, a student who has DACA, or fully undocumented student, depending on that status, they will rely more on CUNY for support and for a sense of belonging, right? Because this is how we taught ourselves, the CUNY American Dream Machine. New York State in particular wants to be a sanctuary state, a sanctuary city, but then we get punished. Also, there are no assurances from CUNY that say, ICE sometimes has recruited on campus, right, on some college campuses, right? So there's a problem there if we're going to say that we support you and we're there for you, and then we allow the actual enforcement agency that's in charge of removing you when we allow them onto campuses, right? So there's that contradiction, and the students are aware of this, right? They see this, and but despite that, right, despite those realities, the students are expressing that they do count on the school, its administrators, its professors, its different offices, to provide them with a sense of security, right? They are relying on CUNY to provide them with the support that the federal government is so vociferously challenging, right? And so to that extent, for example, what's happening with the New York State Dream Act, we need to do a better job in terms of having our students feel that they do belong and that they are being supported, right? So it's a great thing that the New York State Dream Act happened, but then when you have students being given, they're sent emails saying, you got money and then the money is zero, that's a problem. And that's because it wasn't implemented properly. It was implemented a month before school began. Like, there's all of these host of problems. But I think that the takeaway message from the study is that CUNY is doing a good job sending the message that we're here for you, and students are feeling like, okay, you got my back, I'm counting on it, but when push comes to shove, are we really delivering that, right? And I think that the jury is still up, is still out on that. That's my takeaway message for now. Thank you.
Can we go a bit over, Dan? Yeah? All right. So we're just going to go a bit over there. So I'm just going to do real quick, you know, I wrote this thing with Sarah, and I'm just going to. I wanted to sort of get across to you just a little bit of what it's like to be in a court hearing, because we hear so much about it. This is where the decisions are made to expel tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people annually. You know, actually, the numbers are way down. Interestingly enough, the latest report. Oh, I barely found it. It's about 170,000, I think, from about last year, down from about 450,000 under Obama, which is kind of interesting about vindictiveness. And the other thing is, so it's down to 143,000. Which is 143,000. It's not like peanuts, right?
2019.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that of those 140,000, the great, seen as the criminal alien and so on and so forth, 64% had been convicted of a crime, but a vast majority were convicted of very minor crimes, misdemeanors, and one of the biggest crimes was DUI. Without actually a victim, apart from the person, right? So they didn't kill anybody and so on and so forth. So when you go into court, you're going into, I write about, and I've written about this before, a theatre, right? Court, sometimes you see plays about court proceedings. The old television series, Perry Mason was a big one. I don't know who they do now, maybe Law and Order, But these are terribly performance-laden settings. And it's filled with emotion, filled with, as Shirley said, anguish, filled with tragedy, right? In many cases. And filled with all kinds of incredible levels of inequalities, obvious inequalities, sometimes very kind of unseen inequalities. Men and women come in, as you probably know, they come in, if they are coming into the court, because in many courts, the deportable alien, not even allowed in the court, because they're doing it, they're flashing it in on a video screen. In New York City now, they ended the deportable alien coming into the court. They just come in on a video screen from Hudson County down in New Jersey or Bergen County. They're not even coming in anymore. So they come in, but when they do come in, they come in orange jumpsuit, they come in shackles, and this is an administrative court, right? Versus the judge who's sitting there with his or her nicely dressed, maybe shirt and tie if he's a guy, usually white. Usually from upper middle class. Most of the judges in New York City on the court were former prosecutors. Many of them worked for the government as immigration lawyers. There's only a few, very, very few judges in the immigration courts coming from, say, Legal Aid Society or Bronx Defenders. There's maybe one or two that I know of. In the most recent period, we know that Trump is flooding the courts with new judges. In fact, of the nationwide, half of them would be appointed under Trump. So you can just guess who's coming in to make these decisions. So in my bit on vindictiveness, with the idea is an old idea, but particularly made paramount by Jock Young. And it wasn't just simply about the rationality of the act. Of course, there is a rationality and there's an irrationality because, there's no unintentional consequences, really, of our immigration policies. It's designed to make people suffer. Okay? The processes are designed to make people give up. Detention is designed to break you down. And courtroom appearances are designed to humiliate you. denigrate you, and dehumanize you. So I'm just going to read a little field note, and then we go into questions. The judge is sitting in another room. This is from Varick Street down by Houston. It's the main immigration court where detainees come. Right? If you're not detained, you go to Federal Plaza. The judge is sitting in another room in another state and conducts the hearing from afar through a video screen. The deportable alien, Edwin, a dark-skinned Dominican in his late 20s, sits near his lawyer wearing his orange prison jumpsuit with his hands shackled. The reason the judge is not there is because he was attacked by a deportee about 2 months before, so he wouldn't come into court anymore. Although this is only an administrative and not a criminal court, all detainees are still handcuffed and remain in that contained condition throughout the hearing. The judge is trying to determine the seriousness of the subject's past involvement in the drug trade. The subject was charged more than 10 years ago, when he was 18 years old, with delivering a bag of heroin to a dealer who then sold the merchandise to an undercover agent. This is fairly typical. The judge asks Edwin to describe his role in the drug transaction. Edwin, through a Spanish translator, says that he has put all this down in his affidavit and it is all there in the record. The judge is not satisfied with this answer and tells Edwin to describe again his involvement in the deed. Edwin responds that he fetched the heroin from a nearby location and gave it to the customer. The judge retorts, "That means you had a much bigger role in the crime, didn't you? Do you understand, Mr. E, what you're saying?" Edwin is visibly confused and tries to talk to his lawyer for clarification. The government lawyer interjects and tells the judge that this should be prevented and that Edwin must answer the question without any prompting from his lawyer. The judge upholds his objection. Edwin's lawyer protests and says, "I respectfully ask the court to allow me to confer with my client. Clearly he does not understand the question and the meaning and consequences of this exchange, Your Honour." The judge rules that Edwin cannot talk to his lawyer during questioning and continues. "I am asking you again, Mr. E. I just want the truth. Tell me again your role in this drug transaction." Mr. E receives the Spanish translation of the judge's words and looks around the court. He obviously does not know what to do or say and is flustered. Next to me sits Edwin's mother and sister. The sister is explaining to the mother in Spanish that if the brother says that he sold the heroin, he would be considered a serious drug trafficker, which is an aggravated felony, and therefore would not qualify for a waiver. The judge continues his questioning. "Did you or did you not sell the heroin to the customer, Mr. E?" Yeah, that's it, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's what happened," Edwin finally utters. Edwin's lawyer looks up at the ceiling and grimaces. The sister starts to cry, as does the mother. The government lawyer simply nods his head in obvious satisfaction at the interaction. And the judge says, "Thank you, Mr. E. That's all I wanted to know." Voila. So let's end there. And can we have some questions? Do we have time, Dan?
We are actually out of time. One of the drawbacks of having so much content, which we are all very thankful for, I want to release you from the social convention of sticking around. However, we do have the room for the foreseeable, so if our presenters wish to stick around, answer some questions formally or informally, we're happy to do that. However, officially, we are done. Thank you all for coming. Let's give our presenters a round of applause.